morning and welcome back to World Talks, coming to you live from Warsaw. I'm Jastrzębska. The intensifying Russian strikes, pressure over potential territorial concessions, and the Middle East now competing for attention and resources. Questions are mounting over whether Ukraine can still rely on steady Western support and what that means for the cause of the war. To discuss, I have David Kirichenko, Associate Fellow, Henry Jackson Society, joining me right now. Good morning, David. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me on.
So let's start with Marco Rubio, because he said that Volodymyr Zelensky misrepresented U.S. proposals on security guarantees, even calling his claims that Ukraine might need to cede territory a lie. So this misalignment in rhetoric between the two leaders, how do you read that?
Well, I think Zelensky is trying to summarize his reading of the situation. And I think the Americans don't want to make their proposal seem so obvious that they have been pressuring the Ukrainians to try and cede the territory. But it's clear that throughout the past year, all the pressure has been primarily put on the Ukrainians to come up with concessions, and very little pressure has been put on the Russians. And what the Russians have been pushing for is for Ukraine to give up the Donbass. And the Americans, more or less, have been willing to go with much of the Russian desires. And the Russians right now are struggling to make any progress. And in fact, the Ukrainians in the past few weeks have been able to reverse Russian gains across certain parts of the front line. Ukrainian trenches and fortifications are improving. And Ukraine's on track to produce around 7 million drones by the end of the year. And we can expect Russian casualties to continue increasing. And the current target's around 30,000 casualties per month, 30 to 35,000. And Kyiv wants to bring that up to 50,000. So Russia won't be able to sustain these losses in trying to take the Donbass. And they hope that they can achieve it over the negotiations to take Ukraine's fortress belt. And they've been relaying that to the Americans, and the Trump administration, rather desperate for some sort of agreement or deal, it has that on the line, and they've been pressuring the Ukrainians, whether it's a demilitarized Donbass. It's just quite clear what they're trying to do, and no matter how Rubio or the Trump administration tries to position, it's very clear that Ukraine's being pressured to try and give up that territory. And this talk about some sort of security guarantee certainly would only follow once some sort of deal with the Russians is reached, which they want Donbass in order to have that deal.
Mm-hmm. And Rubio also said something quite striking, that if the U.S. has its own military needs, right, America comes first. So basically, in practical terms, even if nothing has been diverted yet, what does that mean for Ukraine's access to weapons? And where does this place Europe? I mean, will the EU have to step in, and is it able to do so?
I think for the first challenge is going to be the weapons that Europe can't provide, or there's no substitute. So there's definitely going to be some pain felt, I think, and will be felt in the coming months as America diverts more weapons to its needs in Iran. But I think the perspective in Kyiv is the best pathway forward is to have Ukrainian weapons, so weapons that are produced, manufactured in Ukraine. And the latest estimates is somewhere around, or more than half of the frontline weaponry being used by the Ukrainians has been produced inside of Ukraine. So since 2022, Ukraine's domestic defense industry has been ramping up, both on artillery, drone needs, and increasingly in order to sustain a long-term war, whether it's a peace deal reached now and Russia invades in the future. Ukraine understands very much that being able to protect yourself means not being reliant on the U.S. or any other state or power, and strength is going to come within, and that will also help eliminate a lot of the risk of being dependent on these military supply chains or procuring weapons.
A G7 meeting took place in France on Friday, with tensions reportedly flying between Marco Rubio and EU's top diplomat Kaja Kallas over little progress, right, in peace negotiations with Russia. So what does it tell us about the EU-US relationship when it comes to supporting Ukraine?
They definitely have ever increasingly divergent positions on the war. I think Europe is really conscious about reaching a deal that puts Russia into a position to reinvade or have leverage to put more pressure on the Ukrainians and the Europeans into the future. Whereas it seems that the Americans are desperate for any deal and are more than willing to oblige the Russians and pressure the Ukrainians to give them concessions. And I think the Europeans learned from hopefully they learned from their mistake in 2014 that appeasing the Russians and giving them pieces means that they're only going to come back for more. Quite frankly, if the Europeans mustered an army and sent it into Crimea in 2014, all of this could have been invaded. And if the Europeans are forced alongside the Ukrainians to make concessions and give parts of their territory to Russia, I don't think anyone in Europe doubts that the Russians will just keep coming back for more. And the position is they should avoid that and avoid these short-term political desires from the Trump administration.
So let's shift the focus to what is going on in Ukraine and Russia. I wanted to ask you how Russia is faring militarily. We've recently seen Ukraine attack some key oil terminals, including the Ust-Luga. What does it tell us about the future of this conflict, the trajectory?
Well, I would say, having been embedded with units since 2022 on the front line, I've personally seen Ukrainian drones and drone units just kill enormous amounts of Russian soldiers trying to take the smallest amount of territory. And they crawl, they run, they just send these human waves to make little to no gains. And that was considered the world's second most powerful army. And they send just waves of hundreds and hundreds of these soldiers to die to make gains. And they rely so much on psychological warfare to be able to influence people in the West and the US, across European states, to try and show that Russia's all too powerful, they're doing too well. But the reality is, on the battlefield, when you've suffered well over 1 million casualties and you still haven't even taken the region of Donbass over 4 years of fighting, it shows just how much Russia's struggling on the battlefield. And I think one really important aspect of the war to know is that Ukraine is getting stronger militarily and technologically. The drone innovations that not only did the Europeans come to appreciate after September with the drone incursions into Poland and Estonia, but now the Gulf states with Iranian drones, is that Ukraine is driving a drone revolution, and it has become what you can call a drone superpower. And by that nature, it's bringing down the costs of war. So being able to use millions of these cheap drones, it's been able to give Ukraine an upper hand asymmetrically against Russia. And they're using it to neutralize Russia's Black Sea fleet over the water, on land, ground robotics, FPVs, and now increasingly these long-range drone strikes. And they're being increasingly paired with Ukraine's domestic missile production, such as the Flamingo. And these drones and missiles are striking deeper and deeper across Russia, hitting their oil exports, their oil terminals, the military industrial complex, hitting Russia's factories. And Russia's too stretched and too thinned out with its air defenses to be able to protect itself. And the trajectory of the war is that, from one aspect, it's increasingly going to favor Ukraine as warfare becomes more technological and cheaper. And it's one of the reasons why Zelensky is increasingly feeling that he has more and more cards when Trump the other year told them that he had none, and the cost of war will only increase for the Russians, and they will grow more desperate on the battlefield trying to make these gains as Ukraine becomes technologically stronger.
David, and Ukraine has recently reached out to Gulf states to help them deal with the Iranian threat, right, with Iranian drones. What is Ukraine expecting in reciprocity?
Well, first is on the diplomatic front. Ukraine has attempted to woo and sway many of these middle powers to be on Ukraine's side, say even at the UN or diplomatically. And if we think about the leverage that the Gulf states has, they have a lot of influence within the Trump administration just by way of their financial support and interests. The Russians have interests within countries like the UAE, and they've been able to procure a lot of dual-use components, even stashing money in the UAE. And so these Gulf states try to have it both ways by partnering with the US and Europe and the Russians. But now the Russians are providing intelligence, sending drones, and via Iran, those Iranian drones are now bombing those same Gulf countries. So Ukraine is showing that it's a bad deal to partner with Russia because you gain very little, and it's actually Ukraine that is able to offer its support and help become a protector of the skies for these Gulf states, and being allied with Ukraine and the wider Western alliance will be far more beneficial. So diplomatically, Ukraine hopes to turn that tide on the diplomatic front. And two is that Ukrainian drone manufacturers and weapons industry, they are cash strapped, so they're able to produce all these innovations, and naturally the next stage is to be able to sell and export more of these technologies. And that means being able to secure further investments, being able to scale up production, and secure additional funding for R&D operations to help produce the next line of drones and other weapon technology. And the Gulf states have that money, and it's a lucrative opportunity for Ukraine, and continues to show Ukraine as a rising power, and it has a lot more to offer the world than previously thought.
David Kirichenko, thank you so much for joining us this morning and for this informative talk. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World. News update coming up at the top of the hour.